Good morning. Welcome to our Saturday morning word study, and our word study is going to be based on the Old Testament lesson for tomorrow from Genesis chapter 22. And tomorrow is kind of interesting. The first Sunday in Lent ties itself to the passages of sacrifice, and one of the things that we think about in Lent, that people give up things for Lent. Today we're going to hear about somebody giving up something very seriously for Lent, much more than chocolate or something to that effect. So it's about Abraham, and it's kind of interesting. We'll be looking at Genesis chapter 22, so please do look up that in your Bibles. But just previous to that, we see a bunch of positive things happening for Abraham. For instance, Abraham is taken to the promised land, so he's got this established land under his feet. Abraham also was promised a child, and it took forever for that child to come, but finally he does. And this young boy named Isaac. Just previous to our text, Abraham actually signed a treaty with one of the kings, local kings. So it seemed like he was going to have peace in his land as well. So all these good things are happening for Abraham, and that this point is where we see this passage that we have for today. So I'll go ahead and start reading this, Genesis chapter 22, beginning at verse 1. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here am I." He said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains on which I shall tell you." So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took two of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, Stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you." And Abraham took the wood and the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife. So they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, "My father." And he said, Here am I, my son." And he said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son." So they went both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." He said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by its horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the name of that place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said to this day, "On the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." And we will end our reading at that point. The text for Sunday actually has about 4 more verses, but you can see that that's quite a chunk that we're covering in this. And I think it gets the gist of our message that we really want to dig into anyway. So there is more in that final part of the passage, but I think we will have enough with what we have here. So let's look at this verse by verse. First of all, verse 1, after these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, "Abraham," and he said, "Here I am." Of course, we see that this test is kind of an interesting thing. Instead of being tempted like Jesus was in the wilderness, Abraham was tested by God. And in a sense, this is to kind of help Abraham know how much he has to trust in God. Oftentimes, tests increase faith, and temptations are ones that help you remain in faith, or help you, with God's help, remain in faith. So testing actually is to help a person. So anyways, this word test in Hebrew actually has a nuance of having been tested through hardship. And of course, that's really what's happening here for Abraham. Let's move on, though. Verse 2, he said, "Take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains which I will tell you." The word son, your only son there, actually, if we were to translate in English, it would be a usage that we're used to hearing. Your only begotten son is really what it means there. And so we hear that in our creeds and stuff like that. So it's good to see that there's a parallel between Isaac and Jesus in that sense. And we're going to see a lot of parallels in this text. Abraham, of course, did have another son, and Ishmael, we know him. But Isaac is the son of the covenant. And this is where all of this is based upon and draws its significance from. That Isaac is the one that God had promised beforehand. And then God says that through Isaac, all these blessings will take place. One of the rough things to swallow when it talks in here about, I want you to offer him there as a burnt offering, the Hebrew word for burnt offering is also the word that we use in English for Holocaust. It means whole burnt offering, and it's gotten a bad connotation as history has pulled itself through. Intended for proper offerings in the temple, but now we've got a whole different meaning to it, sadly. Let's move on to verse 3. "So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him." Notice that there is no hesitation by Abraham in following God's command. And that's the significant sense of this verse that we have before us, is Abraham quickly, immediately obeyed the Father without question. Although I shouldn't have said without question, because I'm sure he had some questions in his mind as things were going. But he in faith followed what God, as God led. Let's move on to verse 4. "On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar." 3rd day, it kind of leads us to think about Jesus whenever we see 3 days. But there's actually a significance in the Hebrew culture of the 3rd day. It was a sign that if you held on to something for 3 days, you were actually showing your resolve. You were showing your commitment. So 3 days is really important in Abraham doing that. So it does symbolize that he's all in on this, that he's going to do what God tells him to do. Of course, if we think about that in the New Testament, when Jesus was in the grave for 3 days, I guess you could say his death was all in. He was certainly dead. I think I've said this in the past from other Bible verses, that he was dead when he was there 3 days. That was kind of their way of noting whether a person was truly dead. If he was in the grave for 3 days, he was dead. Okay, let's move on now. Verse 5, then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there and worship and come again to you. Stay there. Basically what Abraham is trying to say is, I've got to do this on my own. This is something I have to do from my own heart. I can't be supported by any human. This must take place. I must follow the Lord on my own. So that's the thought there. There's an interesting part of this passage too, on the second half of it, where it says, I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. The verb come again actually is first person plural. We will come again to you. So there's a hint that in faith, Abraham knows that Isaac's coming back. One way or another. May not know how, but Isaac will be with him when he returns. Kind of neat in that. I think we'll see that in one more part of this passage as well, but that's a neat insight starting in verse 5. Verse 6, let's go on. And Abraham took the wood and burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they went both of them together. So Isaac carried the wood. What does that remind you of? Jesus carrying the cross, right? Now, one of the things I'd like to add to this, when it talks about fire, I think sometimes we wonder how he carried the fire. It could have been some coals that were wrapped in leaves. That's sometimes how they transported, hot coals wrapped up. That might have been how they did it. They also were available to them flint and tinder, so they could have done it that way as well. But that's just a minor point compared to the idea that Isaac is carrying the wood on his back, just like Jesus would eventually. Verse 7, though, let's move on. And Isaac said to his father Abraham, my father, and he said, here am I, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering? And this is where we get that second hint that ties to verse 5. But first of all, look at this. My father, my son. This is not a throwaway relationship at all. This is two people that dearly love each other. And yet there is something that's going to happen to separate them because of death. And one's going to have to kill the other. This just doesn't make sense according to our world whatsoever. And yet this has to happen. Okay, so this tender love for each other is here. And yet at the same time, Abraham in faith knows that God will take care of it somehow. And that's what we have in the next verse. Verse 8, Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. God will provide. Abraham in faith is saying, I know that God's going to make this work somehow. Okay. Interestingly, the Hebrew here that we have for the word God will provide actually says God will see for himself. That's how it's translated. We'll talk about that in just a bit because the last verse deals with that same phrase. But God will see is what it's saying. So it's the all-seeing eye of God that knows how things will work. Okay? Let's move on to the next verse. And the next verse is verse 9. When they came to the place where God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. As you can see and as you can probably feel that there's tension growing at this point towards a climax. This is something that I'm sure Abraham is shuddering and quaking and he's upset about. Though the verbs may seem very mechanical in this verse, he built, he laid, he bound, and then he laid the wood, and then he laid Isaac. Can you imagine the emotions that are taking place? Not only for Abraham, but also for Isaac. Being bound and put on the altar. he's trusting his dad, but it sure doesn't look good. I can imagine that both of them are just wondering how we can get out of this situation, but God will provide, right? That's what they're trusting. And of course, Isaac is trusting his father, who's trusting our Father. So that's kind of a thought there. And again, there's a wonderful parallel with New Testament. We have a passage where it says that Jesus became obedient to death, even death on the cross. And here's Isaac on the altar becoming obedient unto death. Something else. Verse 10. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. And here's the climax. This account, of course, is a paradox, because we know in Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 20, verses 1 through 5, Deuteronomy chapter 18, verses 19 through 13, God forbid human sacrifice. So this is not supposed to be taking place. And yet, God had commanded. Abraham was about to. And then verse 11. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, Here am I. The angel, of course, stops Abraham at the last moment. If not stopped, Abraham would have followed through and done it. Now, this angel of the Lord is kind of interesting. We see this kind of thing happening in Old Testament scripture a few times, where it starts off calling a certain being an angel of the Lord, and eventually we see it kind of referring to this being as God. Abraham, at the time of the announcement that he would have a son, Abraham and Sarah, first of all, it was given as this was an angel, and then, of course, then it became the Lord. We could think of other ones as well, but it's that sort of idea. There's a thought that sometimes we, as Christians, could call this Jesus coming before he actually comes in the flesh. They actually term this the pre-incarnate Christ. And this could very well be that situation. Okay? So it's kind of an interesting thought that this angel of the Lord actually is Jesus coming before Bethlehem. Okay? Let's move on. Verse 12. He said, Do not lay your hands on the boy or do anything to him, for I now know that you fear God, seeing that you did not withhold your son, your only son, from me. So he did obeyed without reservation. And this idea that he feared the Lord, hopefully you know now as a Christian that fear is not being afraid of God, but rather holding God in high respect. Honoring him is this kind of fear. And this is what Abraham has. When we talk about we should fear and love God, as we say in our meanings to our Ten Commandments, this is honoring God, holding him in respect. And so what it's talking about is the true honor, the true worship is not withholding anything from God. And this is what we see in our text here. Now, in turn, we see God not withholding his son, but not out of fear for anything, but we actually use another term at that point, agape, self-sacrificing love that God had for the sake of all mankind, that he was willing to give up his only begotten son. Let's move on. Verse 13, and Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his own son. Instead of. Now, it's kind of interesting. We think about a substitutionary sacrifice that the ram took the place of Isaac. And of course, That's what we have in the New Testament. That's what our Christian faith is based on. A substitutionary sacrifice, Jesus, for the sake of all mankind. So you can see there's a wonderful parallel there as well. Let's move on to the last verse, though. So Abraham called the name of the place, "The Lord will provide," as it is said, "To this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided." The Lord shall provide. As I said before, this actually means the Lord sees. Yahweh sees. I think there are some songs, contemporary Christian songs, that use the words Jehovah Jireh. And it would be Yahweh Yireh, but it's that idea, those are the words. God will provide. Okay, so now you know some Hebrew words. Yahweh Yireh. Okay. Now with that, one last thing. There's an interesting parallel in location for this Mount Moriah, because we know, and this becomes a part of history, of geography, this Mount Moriah is actually the place where Jerusalem, specifically the Temple of Solomon, was built. And so Isaac was actually sacrificed on that mountain, okay? This mountain also then becomes the mountain where, on the west face of it, of Mount Moriah, is where Golgotha is as well. So there's a parallel in location between Isaac and Jesus, because he was sacrificed on that mountain for the sake of all mankind. That's a wonderful thing to see, that God actually works through history, making Old Testament truths relate to what's in the New Testament and what is of such great value to us. A precursor for the people of Israel all through their history to see that Jesus is a fulfillment of what happened in the past. So we rejoice in that. One of the things I want to finish with is just the concept of what Abraham had that is similar to us. We all have been blessed just like Abraham in so many ways. But do any of our blessings ever come before him? If they do, that's a challenge. God does not want that. All of us should learn to fear and worship God above any other thing. That's the point of the text. That's the message for us. God bless you in that message, and I hope you look forward to the message tomorrow on Sunday.